The coffee hit Naomi's forearm at 187 degrees Fahrenheit. She knew because she had brewed it herself exactly 4 minutes ago, following the restaurant's precise specifications for their signature dark roast. The pain was immediate, searing, the kind that makes your vision go white at the edges. But Naomi didn't scream. She had learned long ago that screaming only gave people like Brandon Whitfield what they wanted. She stood perfectly still, watching the brown liquid drip from her skin onto the pristine white tablecloth, watching the blisters already beginning to form, watching Brandon's smirk widen into something that looked almost like pleasure. "Next time," he said, loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "Remember that I ordered it with oat milk, not regular." "Stupid bitch!" The restaurant, Aurelius, the most exclusive dining establishment in Chicago, where a single table required a 3-month waiting list and a minimum net worth verification, went silent. 47 of the city's wealthiest citizens sat frozen, forks suspended, conversations abandoned. And in the corner booth, hidden in shadow, a man in a $20,000 suit slowly set down his napkin and rose to his feet. Victor Chen had waited 24 years for this moment. He just hadn't expected it to hurt this much. Brandon Whitfield was 24 years old and had never been told no. Not by his father, Richard Whitfield, whose $14 billion empire had been built on the understanding that Whitfield men took what they wanted. Not by the prep schools that had expelled him for behavioral issues and then quietly readmitted him after substantial donations. Not by the women who appeared in tabloid photographs on his arm, drawn by his money and repelled by everything else. Not by the legal system, which had made 3 DUI charges and 1 assault accusation disappear with the wave of a checkbook. Brandon existed in a universe where consequences were for other people, the poor, the powerless, the ones who couldn't afford to make problems go away. He had never met a problem his father's money couldn't solve. He was about to meet one now. The waitress, Brandon hadn't bothered to learn her name, didn't see why he should, was looking at her arm with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not pain, exactly, not anger. Something more controlled than that, more contained. It irritated him. When you hurt someone, they were supposed to react. They were supposed to cry or beg or at least have the decency to look afraid. This girl just stood there, her dark skin already mottling with burns, her eyes distant and calm, like she was somewhere else entirely. Like she had been hurt worse than this before and survived. "Well," Brandon snapped, "are you going to apologize or just stand there like an idiot? You ruined my shirt." He gestured at the coffee stains on his Brioni cashmere, which cost more than this waitress probably made in 6 months. "This is a $4,000 shirt. You're going to pay for it." Naomi Carter had been working at Aurelius for 7 months. Ever since the mysterious scholarship that had been paying her medical school tuition had also somehow arranged for her to get this job. She hadn't questioned it at the time, couldn't afford to question it, not when the money meant the difference between becoming a doctor and dropping out. The job paid well, the tips were extraordinary, and the wealthy clientele, while often rude, rarely crossed the line into outright cruelty. Until tonight. Until Brandon Whitfield had decided that his incorrect coffee order was grounds for assault. Naomi looked at the burns spreading across her forearm, felt the pain pulsing in waves, and made a calculation. She could report this. She could call the police. She could sue. And Brandon Whitfield's army of lawyers would crush her like a bug, drag out proceedings for years, destroy her reputation and her career before it even started. That was how it worked for people like her. The rules were different. The game was rigged, and the only winning move was to survive long enough to change the rules. "I apologize for the inconvenience, sir," Naomi said, her voice steady despite the pain. "I'll have a replacement coffee prepared immediately, and I'll speak with management about compensation for your shirt." The words tasted like ash in her mouth, but she said them anyway. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not yet. Not until she had her degree, her license, her own power that nobody could take away. She had survived worse than Brandon Whitfield. She would survive this too. That's not good enough. Brandon leaned back in his chair, enjoying the attention from the surrounding tables. This was what he loved. The performance, the demonstration of power, the reminder to everyone watching that he could do whatever he wanted without consequences. I want you fired, tonight. And I want you to admit, in front of all these people, that you're an incompetent... He never finished the sentence. A hand landed on his shoulder, heavy, firm, with the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to be obeyed. Brandon spun around, ready to unleash his fury on whoever had dared to touch him, and found himself looking up at a face he had never seen before. The man was tall, at least 6'3", with skin the color of burnished mahogany and eyes that held a cold intelligence Brandon found immediately unsettling. He was black, which in Brandon's experience meant he should be serving food or parking cars, not wearing a suit that cost more than most people's annual salaries. But there was something about the way he carried himself, something about the absolute stillness of his posture, that made Brandon's instincts scream danger. "Who the hell are you?" Brandon demanded, trying to recover his composure. "Do you know who I am? I'm Brandon Whitfield. My father owns this restaurant. My father owns half this city. You'd better take your hand off me before I have security throw you out on your ass." The man smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "I know exactly who you are, Brandon. I've known since the day you were born." He removed his hand from Brandon's shoulder but didn't step back. If anything, he seemed to loom larger, his presence filling the space between them like a physical force. "My name is Victor Chen, and I'm the man who actually owns this restaurant, this building, and roughly 51% of everything your father has ever claimed to build." The name hit Brandon like a bucket of ice water. Victor Chen, the silent partner, the ghost in the machine of Whitfield Industries, the mysterious investor whose name appeared on documents but never in photographs, who had been a source of speculation and rumor in business circles for as long as Brandon could remember. His father never talked about Victor Chen except in vague, dismissive terms. A necessary evil, a sleeping partner, nobody important. But the way Richard's face tightened whenever the name came up suggested something different, something darker. "Bullshit," Brandon said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "My father is the CEO of Whitfield Industries. He built that company from nothing. You're just... Just what?" Victor's voice was soft, almost gentle. "Just a silent partner, just a name on a contract, just the man who actually founded the company your father takes credit for, who built the algorithms and systems that made your family's fortune, who has spent 30 years in the shadows because America in the 1990s wasn't ready for a black man to be the face of a tech empire." He leaned closer, and Brandon could see something burning behind those cold eyes. "I've been just a lot of things, Brandon. But tonight I'm something else entirely. Tonight I'm the man who watched you pour boiling coffee on my daughter." The word hung in the air like a gunshot. Daughter. Brandon's eyes darted to the waitress, Naomi, her name tag said, though he hadn't bothered to read it before. And for the first time, he really looked at her. The high cheekbones, the intelligent eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw that was so similar to the man standing before him. "That's impossible," Brandon said. "You don't have any children. My father said—" "Your father," Victor interrupted, "has said a lot of things over the years. Most of them lies. All of them designed to keep me dependent, isolated, and under his control." He turned to look at Naomi, and his expression transformed. The cold rage melting into something tender, something vulnerable, something that looked almost like grief. "I didn't know I had a daughter until 5 years ago, and I've spent every day since then trying to find a way back to her that wouldn't put her in danger." Naomi was staring at Victor with an expression that cycled through shock, disbelief, anger, and something that might have been hope. "What are you talking about? My father? I don't have a father. My mother raised me alone. She told me he left before I was born, that he didn't want—" Her voice cracked. "She told me he didn't want me." Victor's composure finally broke. The mask of cold authority slipped, revealing the raw wound beneath. "I never knew you existed," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Your mother disappeared before she could tell me she was pregnant. I spent years looking for her, but she had changed her name, moved across the country, covered her tracks so thoroughly that I thought she didn't want to be found. It wasn't until 5 years ago, when a DNA database match flagged a connection, that I discovered the truth." He took a step toward Naomi, then stopped as if afraid of getting too close. "I've been watching over you ever since. The scholarship that appeared out of nowhere when you were accepted to medical school. The job here at a restaurant I own, where I could see you every Saturday without you knowing who I was. The anonymous donations to the clinic where your mother gets her treatments." His eyes were wet now, tears threatening to spill over. "I wanted to tell you. Every single day, I wanted to walk up to you and tell you the truth. But I was afraid. Afraid you would reject me. Afraid your mother would tell you what I did, what I failed to do, and you would hate me for it." The restaurant had gone completely silent. 47 of Chicago's most powerful people sat frozen, witnessing a family drama that would be the subject of gossip for months. But none of them mattered. The only people who existed in this moment were Victor, Naomi, and the slowly dawning realization that both of them had been lied to for 24 years. "What did you do?" Naomi's voice was barely above a whisper. "What did you fail to do?" Victor closed his eyes. "I let Richard Whitfield convince me that I had to choose between my company and the woman I loved. I let him tell me that a relationship with a black woman would destroy my credibility, that having a mixed-race child would make investors nervous, that I needed to end things with grace if I wanted to keep my stake in the company we had built together." He opened his eyes, and the self-loathing in them was painful to witness. "I was a coward. I chose money over love. I let Richard's people handle the situation, and by the time I realized what that meant, Grace was gone. I thought she had left because she hated me for what I'd done. I never imagined—" His voice broke. "I never imagined Richard had threatened her. I never imagined she had run not because she hated me, but because she was trying to protect me." Brandon had been watching this exchange with growing horror. His mind was racing, trying to process the implications of what he was hearing. If Victor Chen really was the majority owner of Whitfield Industries, if he really had been the silent power behind the throne for 30 years, then everything Brandon had believed about his family, his future, his inheritance, was built on a lie. "This is insane," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "My father would never. He's not capable of—" "Your father," Victor said, turning back to face Brandon with an expression of cold contempt, "is capable of anything. He spent 30 years taking credit for my work, using my money to build his reputation, positioning himself as the genius entrepreneur while I did the actual building from the shadows. And every time I tried to step out of those shadows, every time I hinted that I might want more than a silent partnership, he found a way to keep me in line." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a photograph, yellowed with age, showing a young black woman with warm eyes and a gentle smile. "This is Grace Carter. 25 years ago, she was a junior software engineer at a company Richard and I were acquiring. She was brilliant, passionate, and completely unimpressed by my money or my status. She made me laugh. She made me think. She made me want to be a better man than the one I had become." He looked at Naomi, and the resemblance was suddenly unmistakable. The same eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same quiet strength. "She made me want to be a father." Victor continued, his voice heavy with decades of regret. "When Grace told me she was pregnant, I was terrified. Not because I didn't want a child, but because I knew what Richard would do if he found out. He had spent years making sure I stayed dependent on our partnership, making sure I had no outside loyalties that might threaten his control. A child, an heir, would change everything. It would give me a reason to finally step out of the shadows, to claim my rightful place, to stop being the invisible partner and start being the man I should have been all along. He paused, his jaw tightening. Richard found out before I could figure out how to protect Grace. He came to me with an ultimatum: end the relationship, or he would exercise a clause in our partnership agreement that would allow him to dilute my shares down to nothing. I would lose everything I had built, everything I had sacrificed for. 30 years of work, gone in an instant. Victor's hands clenched into fists at his sides. So I told Grace I needed time to think. I told her I would figure out a solution. And while I was thinking, Richard's people were already moving. They found Grace at her apartment. They told her that if she didn't disappear, if she ever tried to contact me again, they would destroy not just her but me as well. They told her that Richard had evidence of illegal activities I had been involved in during the company's early years. They told her that if she truly loved me, she would leave and never look back. Naomi felt like the floor was tilting beneath her feet. She had spent her entire life believing her father had abandoned her, that he had been too weak, too selfish, too indifferent to stay. Her mother had never spoken of him except in the vaguest terms, always changing the subject when Naomi asked questions, always deflecting with, "He wasn't ready to be a father," or, "Some men can't handle responsibility." She had grown up with a father-shaped hole in her heart, filling it with anger and determination, and the fierce resolve to never depend on anyone the way her mother had depended on a man who wasn't there. And now she was learning that the hole had been carved not by indifference but by design, that her mother hadn't been abandoned, she had been threatened, coerced, forced to choose between the man she loved and the child she was carrying, that her father hadn't been absent by choice but had been manipulated into believing Grace had left of her own free will, that the entire architecture of her childhood pain had been constructed by one man for the sole purpose of maintaining his control over another. "My mother," Naomi said slowly, "sacrificed everything to protect you. She raised me alone, worked 3 jobs, went without so I could have food and clothes and books. She got sick." Her voice cracked. "She got sick, and she couldn't afford treatment. And she still never reached out to you, never asked for help, because she thought she was protecting you from Richard's threats." Victor nodded, tears now flowing freely down his face. "I found out about her illness 2 years ago. The anonymous donations to the clinic. That was me. I wanted to help, but I couldn't reveal myself. I was still trapped in the same cage Richard had built 30 years ago, still afraid of what he would do if I stepped out of line. And then," he turned to look at Brandon, and his expression hardened. "And then I walked into this restaurant tonight like I do every Saturday, just to catch a glimpse of the daughter I've never been able to claim. And I watched this spoiled, vicious child pour boiling coffee on you for the crime of bringing him the wrong milk." Brandon had gone pale. The bravado that had fueled his cruelty was evaporating, replaced by a dawning understanding that he had made a terrible mistake. Not a moral mistake, Brandon didn't think in those terms, but a strategic one. He had picked the wrong target. He had humiliated the daughter of a man who could destroy him. "Look," he said, trying to recover some of his earlier confidence, "I didn't know who she was. It was just a joke, a misunderstanding. I'm sure we can work something out." "A joke?" Victor's voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made Brandon take an involuntary step backward. "You deliberately poured scalding liquid on a young woman who had done nothing wrong. You called her a stupid bitch in front of a room full of witnesses. You threatened to have her fired and humiliated for your own amusement." He took a step toward Brandon, and there was something predatory in his movement now, something that reminded onlookers that Victor Chen had spent 30 years in the cutthroat world of corporate warfare. "That's not a joke, Brandon. That's assault. And more than that, it's a revelation. It's a perfect demonstration of exactly who you are and exactly how your father raised you. Victor reached out and grabbed Brandon's wrist, lifting his arm to expose the watch on his wrist. It was a Patek Philippe, platinum, worth approximately $200,000. On the back was an engraving. "To my real son, VC." Brandon tried to pull away, but Victor's grip was iron. "This watch," Victor said, his voice trembling with rage, "I commissioned 20 years ago. It was supposed to be a gift for my child, the child I was going to have with Grace, the child I was going to raise to be everything I had failed to be. I had it engraved before I even knew if the baby would be a boy or a girl. To my real son. Because to me, any child of mine, regardless of gender, would be my real son, my real heir, my real legacy." He released Brandon's wrist with a shove that sent the younger man stumbling. "Your father stole it from my safe after Grace disappeared. He gave it to you as a 16th birthday present. He told me it had been lost during an office move." Victor's smile was terrible. "I've been staring at that watch on your wrist for 8 years, Brandon. Watching you wear it to parties and polo matches and court appearances for your DUIs. Watching you flash it at women you were trying to impress. Watching you treat it like a toy, like a status symbol, like something you deserved simply because you existed." He shook his head slowly. "You never deserved that watch. You've never deserved anything in your entire life. Everything you have in your education, your trust fund, your freedom from consequences, all of it came from work that I did and credit that your father stole. You're not an heir, Brandon. You're a thief's son wearing stolen jewelry." The restaurant remained frozen in horrified fascination. This was better than any opera, any drama, any entertainment money could buy. The mighty Whitfield family, brought low by secrets that had been buried for a quarter century. Brandon Whitfield, the untouchable golden boy, revealed as a fraud built on fraud. And at the center of it all, a waitress with coffee burns on her arm and a father she had never known, staring at each other across a gulf of 24 lost years. The doors of the restaurant burst open, and Richard Whitfield strode in with the confidence of a man who owned the world, which in many ways he had convinced himself he did. He was 62 years old, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the kind of tan that came from private islands and personal yachts. Behind him trailed 2 assistants, a lawyer and a security guard who looked like he bench-pressed compact cars for fun. "What the hell is going on here?" Richard's voice boomed across the restaurant. "I got a call that my son was being harassed by some—" He stopped mid-sentence as he recognized the man standing over Brandon. "Victor, what are you doing here?" Victor turned to face his partner of 30 years, and something shifted in his expression. The grief and vulnerability he had shown Naomi disappeared, replaced by a mask of cold, calculated rage. "Hello, Richard. I was just having a conversation with your son about the importance of treating service workers with respect." He gestured toward Naomi, who was still standing frozen with coffee burns spreading across her arm. "And about family reunions, it's amazing what you learn when you finally stop hiding and start asking questions." Richard's eyes darted between Victor, Naomi, and Brandon, calculating, assessing, searching for the angle. He had built his entire career on reading people, on finding their weaknesses and exploiting them. But something was different tonight. Something in Victor's posture, in his voice, in the way he was looking at the waitress, set off alarm bells that Richard had spent 30 years hoping he would never hear. "Victor, whatever is happening here, we should discuss it privately. This isn't the place for— This is exactly the place." Victor's voice cut through Richard's attempt at control like a blade. "This is the place where your son assaulted my daughter. This is the place where I finally stopped being your silent partner and started being who I should have been all along." He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had spent 3 decades planning a single moment. "This is the place where I take back everything you stole from me." Richard's face went white. Your daughter? Victor, you don't have a daughter. You told me yourself years ago that you decided not to have children because they would be a distraction from the business. I told you what you wanted to hear, what I had to tell you to survive. Victor took a step toward Richard, and for all his wealth and power, Richard Whitfield actually flinched. But I always knew the truth, Richard. I always knew that Grace didn't leave because she stopped loving me. I always knew that you did something to make her disappear. I just couldn't prove it. Until now. He pulled out his phone and pressed a button. 5 years ago, when I finally found Naomi through a DNA database, I hired investigators to reconstruct what happened in 1999. It took them 3 years, but they found witnesses. They found documents. They found the security guard you hired to deliver your threats to Grace. Victor held up the phone, showing a video file ready to play. And they found this, an interview with that security guard recorded 6 months ago, in which he describes in detail how you ordered him to threaten a pregnant woman with the destruction of everyone she loved if she didn't disappear forever. Richard's composure cracked. That's inadmissible. That's hearsay. Any lawyer would... I'm not trying to put you in prison, Richard, although that might come later, depending on what else my investigators find. Victor pocketed the phone. Right now, I'm doing something much simpler. I'm invoking Section 14 of our partnership agreement, the morality clause, the one that allows either partner to force a buyout if the other partner is found to have engaged in conduct that brings the company into disrepute. He pulled a document from inside his jacket, thick, official, covered in legal seals and signatures. I had my lawyers draw this up 3 months ago. I've just been waiting for the right moment to use it. He handed the document to Richard, who took it with hands that were visibly trembling. As of midnight tonight, I am exercising my majority rights to remove you from the board of directors, terminate your employment as CEO, and buy out your remaining shares at fair market value. Which, given the revelations that are about to become public about your conduct over the past 30 years, will be approximately 40% less than they were worth this morning. Victor's smile widened. You're done, Richard. The company you stole from me, it's mine now. The reputation you built on my work, it's gone. And your son... He glanced at Brandon, who was still standing frozen with the Patek Philippe watch glinting on his wrist. Your son's trust fund, which was funded entirely by company profits that were generated by my innovations. That trust fund is about to be re-examined very, very carefully. Richard's face had gone from white to purple. You can't do this. I have lawyers. I have connections. I'll fight you in every court in the country. With what money? Victor interrupted pleasantly. Your personal accounts are about to be frozen pending an investigation into misappropriation of company funds. Your homes are mortgaged against loans that will be called in by morning. Your friends? He gestured at the restaurant full of wealthy onlookers, all of whom were very carefully not meeting Richard's eyes. Your friends are already calculating how quickly they can distance themselves from you. That's how it works in your world, Richard. Loyalty lasts exactly as long as power does. And your power ended about 5 minutes ago. Richard's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For the first time in his adult life, he had no move to make, no angle to play, no leverage to exploit. He was facing the consequences of 30 years of lies, and he had no idea how to survive it. Finally, he turned to Brandon, as if his son might somehow save him. Brandon, call the lawyers, call security, call who, Dad? Brandon's voice was hollow, stripped of its earlier arrogance. Call the lawyers who work for a company that Victor apparently owns? Call the security guards who take their paychecks from a board that Victor controls? Call the friends who are already pretending they don't know us? He looked at his father with something that might have been hatred, or might have been the first stirrings of self-awareness. You told me our family built this empire. You told me I was the heir to something great, and it was all a lie. Everything. The company, the money, the power, none of it was ever really ours. Victor watched this exchange with an expression that was almost like pity. Your father isn't entirely worthless, Brandon. He's an excellent salesman. He has a gift for making people believe in things that don't exist. That's why I needed him in the beginning. I could build the technology, but I couldn't sell it. Not then. Not as a black man in 1990s America. He shook his head slowly. But somewhere along the way, Richard stopped being my partner and started being my parasite. He took credit for my work, used my money to fund his lifestyle, and systematically eliminated anyone or anything that might give me a reason to break free from our arrangement, including, his voice caught, including the woman I loved and the child I never knew. He turned back to Naomi, who had been watching this entire confrontation in stunned silence. Her arm was still burning, the pain a constant reminder that this night had started with simple cruelty and escalated into something unimaginable. I know I have no right to ask you for anything, Victor said, his voice gentle now, stripped of the cold authority he had used against the Whitfields. I missed 24 years of your life. I wasn't there for your first steps, your first words, your first day of school. I wasn't there when your mother got sick, when you had to drop out of college to take care of her, when you worked 3 jobs just to keep a roof over your heads. His eyes were wet again, tears streaming freely down his face. I can never make up for that. I can never give you back the father you should have had. But I can tell you the truth. I can tell you that I never stopped looking for your mother, never stopped hoping I would find her. Never stopped dreaming about the family we could have been if I had been braver, stronger, better. Naomi stared at him. This stranger who was apparently her father. This powerful man who had spent decades hiding in shadows while her mother struggled in poverty. She wanted to hate him. Part of her did hate him. He had made choices that had shaped her entire life, and those choices had been wrong. But he had also been manipulated, threatened, trapped in a cage built by a man who understood exactly how to exploit weakness. And he had spent the last 5 years trying to help her, trying to protect her, trying to find a way back to her that wouldn't put her in danger. My mother, Naomi said finally, her voice rough with emotion. Does she know about any of this? Victor shook his head. I haven't contacted her directly. I am afraid that she'll hate me, that she'll tell you to hate me, and you would be right to hate me. Both of you would be right. He took a shaky breath. But I couldn't let tonight go by without finally telling you the truth. Not after watching what Brandon did to you. Not after watching Richard's son treat my daughter like garbage while wearing a watch I bought for her on his wrist. He looked at Brandon, then at Richard, then back at Naomi. I've spent 30 years being silent. 30 years letting other people tell my story, control my narrative, decide who I was allowed to be. Tonight, I'm finally telling my own story. And the first chapter is this. I am your father. I love you. And I am so sorry. The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected sound. Applause. It started slow, a single pair of hands clapping near the back of the restaurant, then spread like wildfire until the entire room was on its feet. Not applause for Victor's wealth or power, applause for his vulnerability, for his willingness to admit his failures in front of witnesses, for the raw humanity he had displayed in a world that usually valued only strength. Richard Whitfield stood in the middle of this ovation, alone, abandoned, watching everything he had built crumble around him. He made one last, desperate attempt. Naomi, Miss Carter, whatever Victor has told you, you have to understand, I was trying to protect him. The world in 1999 wasn't ready for an interracial relationship at that level of business. I was trying to save his career, his reputation. You were trying to save your control, Naomi interrupted, her voice steady despite the pain in her arm. Ow. You were trying to make sure he never had anyone else to care about, anyone who might give him the courage to stop being your silent partner and start being the man he should have been. She looked at him with the clinical detachment of someone who had learned to read people in order to survive. I've worked in this restaurant for 7 months, Mr. Whitfield. I've served you dinner at least a dozen times, and you've never once looked at me like I was a person. I was furniture to you, a piece of equipment that delivered food and took away plates. She gestured at her burned arm. Your son learned that attitude from somewhere. He learned that some people don't matter, that some people can be hurt without consequences, that some people exist only to serve the comfort of people like him. He learned it from you. Richard's face contorted with something that might have been shame, or might have been rage at being judged by someone he considered beneath him. You don't understand anything. You're just a... She's just a what, Richard? Victor's voice was soft, but deadly. Just a waitress? Just a poor black girl from the South Side? Just the illegitimate daughter of your inconvenient business partner? He moved to stand beside Naomi, and the resemblance between them was undeniable now. The same proud bearing, the same intelligent eyes, the same stubborn jaw. She's a medical student at one of the best schools in the country, maintaining a 3.9 GPA while working full-time to support her family. She's smarter than your son will ever be, stronger than he could ever dream of being, and worth more than everything your family has ever accumulated. And as of tonight, she's also my heir. The word landed like a bomb. Brandon, who had been retreating into sullen silence, suddenly straightened. Heir? What do you mean, heir? Victor smiled coldly. I mean that the 51% stake in Whitfield Industries, which will be renamed Chen Industries by the end of the week, will eventually pass to Naomi Carter, my biological daughter and legal heir. I mean that the fortune your family thought they were going to inherit is going to a woman Brandon just assaulted in front of 40 witnesses. He looked at Brandon with something that might have been satisfaction. I hope the coffee was worth it. 3 weeks later, Naomi stood in the lobby of Chen Industries' Chicago headquarters, wearing a visitor's badge and trying to process how drastically her life had changed. The burns on her arm had healed, leaving faint scars that she suspected would never fully fade. The media firestorm had mostly died down, though she still occasionally saw her face on tabloid covers with headlines like Secret Heiress and Billionaire's Hidden Daughter. She had taken a leave of absence from medical school to deal with the chaos, but Victor had assured her that her scholarship would be waiting whenever she was ready to return. He had also offered her access to his fortune, his connections, his entire world. She had refused everything except the one thing that mattered: the truth. Victor had arranged for her to meet her mother's family, relatives Grace had cut off when she went into hiding, aunts and uncles and cousins who had spent 24 years wondering what had happened to her. He had arranged for Grace to receive the best cancer treatment money could buy, in a private hospital where she didn't have to worry about bills or insurance or any of the 1,000 bureaucratic nightmares that made being sick in America so much harder than it needed to be. And he had arranged this meeting, in this lobby, on this particular day, because today was the day Naomi had finally agreed to speak to him alone. They sat in his office, surrounded by the evidence of his success, the awards, the patents, the photographs with tech industry legends, and Naomi noticed that there were no pictures of Richard Whitfield anywhere. Victor had spent the past 3 weeks systematically erasing his former partner from the company's history, replacing the narrative of Richard Whitfield's genius with the truth of Victor Chen's innovations. The transition had not been smooth. There were lawsuits, investigations, shareholders demanding explanations. But Victor seemed energized by the chaos rather than overwhelmed by it. For the first time in 30 years, he was fighting his own battles rather than hiding behind someone else's name. "I spoke to my mother last night," Naomi said. Victor's expression flickered with something like hope, quickly suppressed. "What did she say?" "She cried for about 3 hours." Naomi looked down at her hands, remembering the way her mother had held her, the way 24 years of secrets had poured out in a flood of tears and confessions and apologies. "She told me everything, about how she met you, how she fell in love with you, how she found out she was pregnant. She told me about the night Richard's men came to her apartment, about the things they threatened to do to you if she didn't disappear, about how she spent the next 2 decades believing she had made the right choice, even when she was working double shifts just to keep the lights on." Victor's face had gone pale. Does she? "She doesn't hate you." Naomi looked up, meeting his eyes. "She says she stopped hating you a long time ago. She says she realized, somewhere around my 10th birthday, that you were as much a victim of Richard as she was. That you had been manipulated, controlled, trapped in a prison you didn't even know you were in." She paused. "She says she forgives you, for whatever that's worth." Victor made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "It's worth everything. It's worth more than everything I have." He stood abruptly and walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. When he spoke again, his voice was rough. "I've spent 30 years hating myself for what happened. 30 years believing that Grace left because I failed her, because I wasn't strong enough to protect her, because I chose money over love. And part of that is true. I did choose money. I was a coward. But I didn't know—" He turned back to face Naomi. "I didn't know that Richard had threatened her. I didn't know that she left to protect me. I spent all those years thinking I was the villain of the story, and it turns out I was just another victim." Naomi considered this. "You're not a victim. You're a person who made bad choices under impossible circumstances, who has spent the last 5 years trying to make up for those choices, and who still has a lot of work to do before you can call yourself a good father." She stood and walked over to join him at the window. "But you're not a villain either. The villain is the man who built his entire empire on manipulation and lies. The villain is the man whose son poured hot coffee on a stranger because he thought there would be no consequences." She looked out at the same city where her mother had struggled, where she had grown up poor, where she had worked 3 jobs just to survive. The villain lost, and now you have a chance to be something better than what he made you. Victor was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a watch, the Patek Philippe, the one Brandon had worn on his wrist for 8 years. Victor's lawyers had retrieved it as part of the asset seizure, and Victor had been carrying it ever since. "This was supposed to be yours," he said, holding it out to Naomi. "I had it made before you were born, before I even knew if you would be a boy or a girl. To my real son. Because in my mind, any child of mine would be my real heir, my real legacy, regardless of gender." He turned the watch over to show the engraving. "Richard stole it and gave it to Brandon. He wanted me to see it on Brandon's wrist every time we met. He wanted to remind me of what I had lost, what I could never have, what he controlled." He pressed the watch into Naomi's hands. "I don't want it to be a reminder of loss anymore. I want it to be a promise that I will spend whatever time I have left trying to be the father I should have been. Not perfect, I know I can never be perfect, but present. Available. Committed to making up for 24 years of absence, one day at a time." His voice cracked. "Will you let me try?" Naomi looked at the watch in her hands. Heavy, expensive, engraved with words that had been meant for her before she was even born. She thought of all the years she had spent hating a father she had never met, all the anger she had carried, all the questions she had been afraid to ask. She thought of her mother, lying in a hospital bed, finally telling the truth after 2 decades of silence. She thought of Brandon Whitfield, who had poured hot coffee on her arm because he believed there would be no consequences, who had spent his entire life believing that people like her existed only to serve people like him. And she thought of Victor Chen, who had spent 30 years in the shadows, who had watched his life be stolen piece by piece, who had finally found the courage to fight back on the night his daughter was attacked. "I'm not ready to call you Dad," she said finally. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready. You can't buy your way into a relationship, and you can't make up for 24 years with one dramatic gesture, no matter how satisfying it was to watch Brandon's face when you revealed the truth." Victor nodded, his expression pained but accepting. "I understand. I'm not asking for... I'm not finished." Naomi held up the watch, examining it in the afternoon light. "I'm not ready to be your daughter in the way you might want, but I'm willing to try being your family. Slowly, carefully, on my terms and my mother's terms, not yours." She met his eyes steadily. "And the first thing I want, if you really mean what you say about making amends, is for you to use your money and your power to help people who grew up like I did. Not charity galas and tax-deductible donations, real help. Clinics in underserved neighborhoods, scholarships for first-generation students, legal aid for people who can't afford to fight back against people like Richard Whitfield." Victor stared at her for a moment, and then a slow smile spread across his face, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. "You know, when I imagined what my child might be like, I always pictured someone fierce, someone who wouldn't be impressed by money or status, someone who would push back against me, challenge me, make me be better than I thought I could be." He reached out, hesitantly, and touched her shoulder. "I never imagined I would actually get to meet that person, and I never imagined she would be even more extraordinary than I dreamed." 6 months later, the Chen Foundation opened its first community health clinic on the south side of Chicago, 3 blocks from the apartment building where Grace Carter had raised her daughter alone. The clinic offered free medical care, mental health services, and legal aid to anyone who needed it. No questions asked. Naomi, who had returned to medical school with a new sense of purpose, volunteered there every weekend. Victor came with her sometimes, not as a billionaire dispensing charity, but as a father trying to understand the world his daughter had grown up in. Grace Carter attended the opening ceremony. It was the first time she and Victor had seen each other in 25 years. They stood on opposite sides of the crowd at first, neither quite sure how to bridge the gap that time and trauma had created. Then Grace walked over, took Victor's hand, and said simply, "Thank you for finding her, for telling her the truth, for being brave enough to fight back when it would have been easier to stay silent." Victor couldn't speak. He just held her hand and cried. The same tears he had been holding back for a quarter-century finally released. Brandon Whitfield pleaded guilty to assault charges and received 2 years of probation, along with a court order to attend anger management classes and perform community service. The community service was assigned to the Chen Foundation Clinic, where Brandon spent 6 months mopping floors and restocking supplies under Naomi's supervision. He never apologized. His pride wouldn't allow it. But by the end of his service, something in his eyes had changed. The casual cruelty was gone, replaced by something that might have been the beginning of self-awareness. Richard Whitfield fought the buyout for 18 months before his lawyers finally convinced him he couldn't win. He received a settlement that left him technically wealthy but socially destroyed. No one in Chicago's business community would touch him, and the revelations about his treatment of Grace had made him a pariah in polite society. The last anyone heard, he had moved to a private island somewhere in the Caribbean, living alone with his bitterness and his memories of the empire he had lost. On the 1-year anniversary of that night at Aurelius, Naomi stood in the restaurant where everything had changed. It had been renamed Grace's now, after a woman who had sacrificed everything for love and survived, and it operated as a training program for young people from underserved communities who wanted careers in hospitality. Victor had donated the building and funded the program, but Naomi ran it. She interviewed the candidates herself, looking for the same qualities she saw in her mother: strength, resilience, the refusal to let circumstances define you. She was setting up tables for the evening service when Victor walked in, carrying a box wrapped in blue paper. "I know we said no gifts," he began, but Naomi was already smiling. "You've never been good at following rules." She took the box and opened it carefully. Inside was a frame containing 2 photographs side by side. On the left, a young Victor and a young Grace, standing on a beach somewhere, arms around each other, looking at each other like the rest of the world didn't exist. On the right, a recent photo of Victor, Grace, and Naomi, taken at the clinic opening. 3 people who had lost 25 years but were determined not to lose any more. "I found the first photo in my files last week," Victor said. "I had forgotten I even had it, but looking at it reminded me of something I should never have forgotten, that before I was a businessman, before I was a partner, before I was anything else, I was a man who loved a woman and wanted to build a family with her." He touched the frame gently. "I failed at that. I failed spectacularly and tragically, but I got a second chance, and I want you to know that I will spend every day of that second chance trying to be worthy of it." Naomi looked at the photographs, at the young couple who had been torn apart, at the older family that had somehow found its way back together. "My mother told me something last week," she said. "She said that when she was hiding from Richard's threats, when she was struggling to survive, when she thought she would never see you again, she used to tell me stories about a prince who had been trapped by an evil sorcerer, a prince who couldn't rescue the princess because he didn't know she needed rescuing, a prince who was waiting, somewhere out there, for the curse to break so he could find his way home." She looked up at Victor, and for the first time, she let herself see not the stranger who had disrupted her life, not the billionaire whose drama had upended everything she thought she knew, but the father who had spent 30 years looking for her without knowing she existed. "I thought they were just fairy tales. I thought she was making up stories to help me sleep. But she wasn't, was she? She was telling me about you. She was telling me that somewhere there was a man who loved us, who was trapped, who was waiting for the chance to come home." Victor's voice was barely a whisper. "I was. I didn't know I was waiting, but I was." He reached out and pulled her into a hug, the first real hug they had shared, the first time she had let him hold her like a daughter. "And I finally found my way home." The restaurant filled with customers that evening, wealthy patrons and neighborhood residents, teenagers from the training program, and elderly couples who remembered when this building had been something else entirely. They all ate together, served by staff who had been given second chances, in a space that had been transformed from a temple of exclusivity into a celebration of community. And at a corner table, 3 people sat together: a man who had spent 30 years in shadows, a woman who had spent 25 years in hiding, and a daughter who had spent her entire life waiting for a family she didn't know she had. They didn't talk about the past that night. They didn't talk about Richard or Brandon or the pain that had shaped all of their lives. They talked about the future, about the clinic, about Naomi's medical school graduation next spring, about the possibility that Grace might move to Chicago to be closer to her daughter and the man she had never stopped loving. They talked about second chances and new beginnings and the strange, unexpected ways that families find each other. And when the meal was over, when the other customers had gone and the staff had begun cleaning up, Naomi excused herself and walked to the spot where, exactly 1 year ago, she had stood with hot coffee burning her arm and a stranger's cruelty ringing in her ears. She stood there for a long moment, remembering the pain, the humiliation, the rage she had felt at being treated like she was worthless. Then she smiled, because that moment, that terrible, painful moment, had been the beginning of everything. It had brought her a father, restored her mother's hope, and proved something she had always believed but never been able to demonstrate: that cruelty eventually faces consequences, that truth eventually emerges from shadow, and that the people who treat others as worthless are usually the most worthless of all. She touched the scars on her arm. Faded now, barely visible, but still there. Still a reminder of what had happened, what had changed, what she had survived. Then she walked back to the table where her parents were waiting, sat down between them, and raised her glass. "To second chances," she said. "To family," Victor added. "To coming home," Grace finished. Their glasses clinked together, and somewhere in the universe, a balance that had been out of alignment for 25 years finally settled into place. The prince had escaped the sorcerer. The princess had come out of hiding. And the kingdom they were building, together finally after all this time, was just beginning.